Welcome. We're glad that you're here. If you're visiting or you're maybe came with a family or friend, there are Bibles underneath the seat in front of you, and we encourage you to grab one of those and join along. We're in the book of Genesis in the 40th chapter, and we're looking at the life of Joseph. And Joseph was an interesting Bible character as we're looking at just some of the difficulties that Joseph endured. Remember early on, Joseph was having dreams, and his dreams were that God was going to elevate him to a place where even his brother and his mom and dad were under his authority. And it was a dream that really bothered his brothers and his dad. You know, his dad pondered it, but his brothers became very jealous of Joseph. He was daddy's favorite, and they began to plot against him. And it's interesting that their attempt was to kill him. And yet God had his hand of protection upon Joseph. Even from an early age, at 17 years old, is when they had considered ridding themselves of Joseph. And Reuben, his oldest brother, says, you know what, rather than kill him, let's throw him in a pit. And then Joseph's intent was he'd pull him out later. Now, that never transpired because as they were eating lunch, they saw some Ishmaelites coming through, and they were on a journey to sell their goods to Egypt, and they thought, what a better idea it would be to sell Joseph as a slave, and then we'll at least make a couple bucks, and we'll not have to worry about killing him. You know, our hands will be clean, at least from murder. We'll just sell him into slavery. And they do. They sell them. They get 20 pieces of silver, and that would have been just enough for 2 pieces of silver each. And so for 2 pieces of silver, they sell their brother. And he goes into Egypt. And what's interesting is he goes to the slave blocks. You know, they put him up for auction, and they're going up and what kind of muscles this guy have, and how good looking is he? And so they get him, and one of the chief commanders of the army of Pharaoh purchases him. And he goes into the house of Potiphar. And he became just a blessing to the house of Potiphar. Matter of fact, it says that everything that Joseph did prospered. So much so that Potiphar put him in a position of authority in the household, and it says that Potiphar didn't worry about anything that was happening in the house. All that he had to worry about was his food. Just make sure you don't come late to supper. That was the only thing that Potiphar had to worry about, that he ate. And it wasn't long before Potiphar's wife began to cast longing eyes. That's how the scripture describes it. She was, trying to lure Joseph in, and she was very bold in doing so. She said, come lie with me. It doesn't get, that's more than just hitting on him, right? It was, come lie with me. And Joseph stands up and he says, look, I can't lie with you. Number one, my boss is giving me great responsibilities, and God is the one who I'd be sinning against, and I can't do that to God. And she becomes furious, and this is what we know in the scripture. It tells us that she, day after day, was tempting him. And yet he wouldn't give in. He never wavered, not once. He didn't fall for her trap. And the scripture tells us that one day she had set it up so that no one else was in the room, and she catches him, she grabs him, and she says, lie with me. And Joseph ran out of the room, leaving his robe, his clothing in her hands. And then she falsely accuses him of attempted rape. And they put him into a prison. Now think about how horrible that would be. He's been the good guy. He's been the guy with integrity, character. But now he's paying a very heavy price. He's getting thrown into prison, and it's a life sentence, is what it was. There was no deliverance date or time of standing before a judge and having his case heard. He was just thrown into prison. And it's believed that Potiphar actually believed Joseph. He knew the character of his wife, and he also knew the character of Joseph. And rather than having him executed, he had him put into prison. He had to do something. And while he's in prison, it tells us in chapter 39, verse 21, about his prison time. Watch what it says. But the Lord was with Joseph, and he showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Even in prison, God was with him. And God was prospering him. Matter of fact, he got elevated to the place where he was the one who was running the prison system in Egypt. God was teaching Joseph some very important lessons. It tells us in the last verse of chapter 39, the Lord made it prosper. God's hand all over Joseph. Now, what we're going to come to as we're going to take chapter 40 and 41, and we're really, as we're going through the life of Joseph, we're looking at 13 years from the time we've been introduced to Joseph to the time that we finish him raising up to second in command. 13 years from the time he was sold, I should say, to the time that we're now seeing him second in command of all of Egypt. A 13-year period. 7 years most likely in the house, and then he's going on another 7 years in the prison. And so we're going to jump right in chapter 40, and it's there in verse 1. It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with the two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. Check this out. And he, Joseph, served them. So they were in custody for a while. The chief butler, that would have been the guy who is really waiting on the king on a daily basis. He's also known in other places as a cupbearer. He would be the one who would bring the wine to the king. He was kind of the food taster, make sure nobody was poisoning the king. It was a very high position, a very prestige position in the kingdom. And he, for some reason, is brought into question, made the king angry, along with the baker. And Joseph was given the responsibility of caring for them. And the scripture uses a very interesting word. It says that he served them. Remember, he was a slave in Potiphar's house, and now he's a slave in the prison. He's serving those upper chief baker and chief butler. And he does it with great joy. And you notice that in the next few verses, that Joseph isn't there just angry and bitter. He's not there just kind of, I can't believe I get put in this position. I've done nothing wrong. We don't see any of that attitude in the life of Joseph. Matter of fact, you see the attitude that he knows that God's hand is upon his life. Great favor that God had given him in the prison. Notice what it says in verse 5 there. And the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night. Each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them, and he saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of the Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" Isn't that very perceptive of Joseph? I mean, you think about it. He had his own issues going on. If anyone should have looked sad, it should have been Joseph, right? Falsely accused of rape, sold into slavery by his own family members. He's there now serving these guys, kind of their personal attendants as he's in the prison. And it says that Joseph notices that they were sad. Guys, that's the heart of a servant. He's looking at the concerns of others, even over his own concerns, isn't it? And he takes a note of it. He goes, "Guys, every day you guys seem pretty happy, but you guys look pretty sad today. What's going on here?" And they begin to confide in him. They now tell him why they're sad. There in verse 8, it says, when they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there's no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me, please." Because I love Joseph's perspective on the whole thing. He just simply comes back and goes, guys, what's going on? They go, you wouldn't understand, Joseph. We both had dreams, and there's no one to interpret these dreams for us. You see, it was the custom of the Egyptians when they had a dream, it meant something. And they would go to the magicians, and we'll see Pharaoh do that in chapter 41. He calls the magicians and the wise men to interpret his dream for him because it was a spiritual thing, and it was something that they would try to discern as soon as it would happen. And now they're behind closed doors in a prison, and they're going, we don't know who to turn to. We don't know any interpreters. We're in the prison now. And Joseph goes, wait a second, guys, wait a second here. Don't you understand that God is the one who interprets dreams, and I know God? That's pretty cool. It's pretty cool that Joseph doesn't try to say, well, let me tell you guys, I've had a few dreams in my life, and I've been able to interpret those. He was just like, let me tell you something. I know the God who interprets dreams. Let me know what it is you're dreaming, man, and I'll give you the interpretation of it because God speaks to me. I have a relationship with God. Now, these guys have enough confidence in Joseph, and I think his reputation, integrity is still intact, even after all the accusations, where he just simply says, the chief butler told him his dream to Joseph. He said, behold, in my dream, a vine was before me. In the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded. Its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into this dungeon. An interesting perspective. You see, the chief butler, the cupbearer, just says, you know what, I'll tell you my dream. I'm going to lay it out with you, Joseph. You say you know God. You say that the God's able to interpret dreams. This is what happened. And he gives them the whole dream. He goes, that was easy. I know exactly what happened. God's already showed me what happened. This is how I went down. In 3 days, you're going to be right back in your position as butler. But I want to ask you one favor. I don't want you to owe me a lot of money right now. I just interpreted your dream. But I don't want your money. I just want you to remember me on the day that you stand before Pharaoh, because you're going to be before his presence in 3 days' time. Now, it's interesting that Joseph had such confidence in his interpretation. He knew, look, I know exactly what's going on because he knew God. Guys, and I think as we're going through these 2 chapters, I think there's something that we continue to see as a theme here, and that theme is simply that God knows the future. God knows what's going to happen before it happens. And all of these things are being set up for Joseph to be elevated, to fulfill the very first dream that he had, that he would become authority in the world, that his mom and dad would bow down to him, that his brothers would bow down to him, because God had a plan for his life. In the book of Isaiah, and I'm going to ask you to turn there, Isaiah chapter 46. Check this out. I think it's one of those verses that you should highlight. You should memorize. You should take note of. Isaiah chapter 46, because I think Isaiah gives us a great perspective when it comes to God's understanding of things to come. Look what it says there in Isaiah 46. Look at verse 8 with me. Remember this, and show yourself men. Recall to mind, O you transgressors, remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. Look at verse 10. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done. Saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Guys, this is God talking. I'm God. Remember how I've dealt with everyone up until this point, and remember that I'm the one who's in control of things yet to happen. That's God. And I think for you and I, in the days that we're living, I think it's an important reminder. He was telling Isaiah, telling the people, remember this. And I think it's important you and I remember this, that everything that's happening in our world, God's in control. He told us it would happen before it ever happened. You can go back and read the book of Revelation, and you can find out that God has laid out how the events of the world would transpire in the last days. Because God's the one who is in control of the future as well as history. And Joseph is saying to this butler, he's going, look, let me tell you something. God's the one who's in control. And God gave you a dream so that you would know what's going to happen in the days to come. God is going to elevate you back into your position as the butler. Now, the baker's listening to all of this, and it was a favorable interpretation. He's going, man, that was good. He's going to get back into his position. Let me tell you my dream. Now, look at this. Chapter 40, verse 9. Verse 15. Verse 16. There we go. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and he said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now, I would imagine if the baker would have asked for an interpretation before the butler would have never asked. Right? But the butler asked first. The butler asked, goes, oh, that was a great interpretation. God, I'm going to get back in my position. And here comes the baker. He goes, that was a great interpretation. What is it that you want to, tell me my dream too. And he goes, let me tell you something. Your head's gone. You're a dead man. Guys, there's one thing about being someone who speaks on behalf of God. You look at guys like Joseph and you look at the prophets, is that sometimes you got to bring good news and sometimes you got to bring bad news. And either way, you got to be faithful to the news that you've been given, right? I'm sure Joseph going, I don't know how to tell you this, right? Let me tell you, this isn't good. This isn't going to turn out well. You're dead. That dream, God just revealed to you that in 3 days, you're going to be hanging on a tree and the birds are going to start eating your flesh. Can you imagine for the next 3 days? The butler is going, man, isn't that Joseph awesome? And the baker goes, he's a false prophet. I want to find a different interpreter. I want to find someone that's going to tell me what I want to hear. And let me just say, it's better to hear truth than to hear what you want to hear. And God was going to reveal truth to this man so that he can prepare himself for what was going to come, even though it was going to be his life taken. I would rather know that, I'm going to meet certain death so I can prepare for certain death than to someone to tell me that, it's all going to be just fine and dandy, and then not be prepared when that day comes. You see, God always gives a warning. And it's interesting, 3 days later, of course, all of this comes to pass, all of them, both waiting for that day to come to pass. And then look at verse 20. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all of his servants. He lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among the servants. He restored the chief butler to his butlership again. He placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, and he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Wow. It happened just exactly like Joseph told him, because God had given him the interpretation of the dreams. Now, what do you think's going on in the butler's mind? Hey, that Joseph's pretty good, right? He knows how to interpret dreams all right. But, look at verse 23. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Could you imagine? That no good for nothing butler. Here I was, helping him out, at least putting a good word for me, and that turkey forgot all about me. Guys, I would call this a dose of divine amnesia. This was divine amnesia. You see, God had a particular time and a particular place that the butler would have to speak up, but now he forgets about it for 2 years. Can you imagine? For 2 years, every time that prison door opened, he's going, okay, they're coming to get me out of here, finally. And then, here they close again. 2 years pass. And Joseph now, that forget it. I'm here forever. Never going to get out of here. It's never going to happen. That butler, man, if I ever get an opportunity to get my hands on that guy. Not once did Joseph murmur, complain. Joseph, at this point, understands, well, look at verse 40, chapter 41, that is, verse 1. And it came to pass, at the end of 2 full years, that Joseph had a dream. And behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river, and the ugly and the gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking fat cows, so Pharaoh awoke. Can you imagine having one of those dreams? You've ever had those dreams? You just kind of like, wow, that was weird. Just there's big old, just healthy, fat cows just eating away in the side of the river, and you're kind of watching those cows graze, and then all of a sudden you look to the side, and there's 7 just ugliest looking cows you've ever seen in your life, skinny as can be. And then you're watching them, and the skinny cow pulls out a fork and starts sharpening his knife, starts eating the other fat cows, and Pharaoh wakes up and he goes, that was weird. Probably smiled over at Pharaoh. One of those weird dreams. And I'm sure Pharaoh woke up going, man, I'm never eating red chili again after 10. No more pepperoni. That's it. He goes back to sleep again, and then watch this. It's incredible. It says, he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up, one on one stalk, plump and good. And behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. I mean, kind of wake up and going, man, where am I at? What's going on? Oh, it was a dream. Good. But he had another weird dream. 7 plump grains. And then there were 7 just dried up. The winds had dried it all. And he goes, man, the 7 dry ones ate up the 7 plump ones. And all night, I'm sure he's just tossing and turning, going, man, that was just strange. And, 2 dreams, very similar in nature. And, just going, man, something's up with this. And so he wakes up in the morning, it tells us in verse 8, it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. All the magicians. Now remember, these guys were pretty incredible magicians. If you go forward to the book of Exodus, these are the magicians that are able to take a staff. Remember when Moses stands before the Pharaoh and he says, let my people go, and he throws a staff on the ground, and the staff becomes a serpent. The magicians of Egypt are able to take a staff and throw it on the ground, and their staff became a serpent too. Moses serpent swallowed their serpent, but that's beside the point. They are able to make another serpent. Remember, Moses stands up, he lifts up his staff, and the river turns into blood, and the magicians of Egypt were able to duplicate that. The only thing they couldn't duplicate was bringing forth life. And then the next one is he brings lice, and they said, this is the finger of God. We're messing with God now. This isn't some magic trick. This isn't just some interpretation. This is pretty serious stuff, because they just called lice out of nothing. You know what, Pharaoh, back off. That's what the magicians ended up telling him. So he calls the magicians, he calls the wise men, and they go, we don't know what to tell you, Pharaoh. Now, you got to give them at least enough credit to say that at least they were honest. Right? They didn't try to make something up. Oh, we got the dream. Let's just make something up so Pharaoh, thinks we're smart or something. Remember, it would be later on that Nebuchadnezzar calls his magicians and his wise men in front of him, and it says that Nebuchadnezzar didn't tell them his dream because he didn't want them just to make something up. So he says, I want you to tell me my dream and the interpretation of it. And the guys goes, no one could do that. That's when Daniel comes in and tells him his dream and the interpretation, because he had a relationship with God, remember? And this is what's incredible. He calls these guys in, and they go, we don't know what to tell you. I don't know what that means. Now, verse 9. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my fault this day. About time. 2 years later, right? I remember my fault this day. When Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream in one night. He and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man, he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. So he restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Now here's an interesting thought. He's saying he restored me to my office, and he hanged him. It was... Here's what you need to understand. According to the Egyptian mind, is that the one who gave the interpretation of the dream was responsible for the outcome of the dream. That's how the Egyptians thought. And so they're going, Joseph allowed me to live, had this guy hanged. Can you imagine what this guy's thinking now? For 2 years, I forgot about Joseph. I'm a dead man. This guy has that kind of power. And what was I thinking? He goes, I remember my fault today. He goes, there was this Hebrew guy. He was this. He interpreted our dream to the T. Exactly what he said came to pass. Now, check this out. Verse 14. And Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. Now, in their custom again, there was, they would be completely bald. They would shave their chest, shave their head, shave their arms. And so Joseph, they're in the prison. That wasn't a concern, but now he's going to stand before Pharaoh. And so they go and they do the whole shaving of everything. Get him, in his Egyptian clothing. He stands before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh now addresses him there in verse 15. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there was no one who can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph said, of course, King, I'm Superman. No, that's not what he said. You see, here's what you need to remember about Joseph, is that Joseph understood where his power lied. It wasn't in him. It was in God. And he understood that God was the one who was able to interpret dreams. And notice what he says. This is to the highest men on the face of the earth in that day. Watch what he says. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Wow. Look, King, this isn't about me at all. It's nothing no power I possess. It's not something that I'm special. Let me just tell you something for sure. God. And God's already told me that what He's shown you was for peace and not for destruction. Isn't that pretty cool? That Joseph had that kind of relationship with God, that he was aware, even before they told him the dream, that the dream was for a benefit, not for a destruction. Remember the baker and the butler? One of them had a good dream, one of them had a bad dream. And Joseph was aware that this was a good dream and not a bad dream before he even hears the dream. Guys, that's a relationship with God. And Joseph knew it even before Pharaoh begins to tell him what the dream is. He had been saying, okay, God, I'm going to stand before this guy. What's going to go down here? And then notice, Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat. They fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt. Such ugliness as I have never seen in the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and the ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows, and when they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Can you imagine? He goes, those cows were crazy. Those are the ugliest things I ever saw in my life. They ate up the fat cows and they looked just as ugly as before. They were just as skinny as when before they began their, eating the other cows. And you're going, man, well, what's up with this? And then he tells them the rest of the dream. And he goes, I also saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up out of one stalk, full and good. Behold, 7 heads with withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. Check this out. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. Wow. He goes, let me tell you what's going on here, Pharaoh. You're the king, and God has given you insight because of your position, and he's telling you what's about to go down right now. Because God knew, and he's going to tell him 7 years and 7 years, 2 groups of 7. And he says, let me tell you something. For sure, God has already prepared you. He's already telling you, because you're the ruler of the world right now, that there's going to be 7 years and a 7-year period, and one's going to be a 7 years of prosperity, and then there's going to be a 7 years of famine. And Joseph knows exactly why God had shown it to him. He said, because God's shown you the things that he's about to do. Guys, I love that God knows what's coming next week and next month and next year. You see, we're looking around, we don't know what tomorrow's going to hold, do we? We saw what happened in San Bernardino just this last week. My brother worked across the street for many years at the Trader Joe's, where that terrorist attack just took place. And my brother, they said they had to close down the whole block, and he had just moved stores, and he was working in a different store, but he said, man, I would have been in the place of fire. I mean, it was right there. You see, we're living in days you don't know what tomorrow's going to hold. You don't know what the economy is going to look like. We don't know what kind of terrorism's coming through the doors. We have no clue. You and I are just walking through, just going, man, I don't know. But this is the cool thing. God knows. God knows. And he knows exactly how to sustain you. He knows exactly how to provide for you. He knows exactly what you need, no matter what this world throws at you. God's in control. It's incredible. You know, if you guys watched any of the coverage of this, one of the headlines on, I think it was the Daily News, it said God didn't hear the prayers, or some ridiculous like that. You know what? God was the one who is in the middle of everything that's going down. And what's fascinating, you go like, wait a second, God allowed something that horrible? Let me tell you something, man. God is well aware of every situation, every circumstance. In Joseph's life as well as in Pharaoh's life. And what was going on a worldwide basis, God was still on the throne. And here's the fascinating part, is that God is going to give them the wisdom to prepare for it, and they could either take the counsel of God or they could ignore the counsel of God. I think you and I have that same opportunity. You see, God already knows what's going on. You can heed what He wants to tell you. You can listen to what He's saying to you, or you can kind of blow it off and say, I don't want to hear what God is just saying. I'm going to do whatever I want to do, and there's a consequence for that. God is preparing us for the day, and He's told us to be ready. You and I need to be ready. He is coming back, and I'm expecting Him sooner than later. And the question is, are you going to be ready when He comes back? You can sit there and go, well, I didn't know, or I didn't know. He's already told you everything. He told you one day you're going to stand before Him and give an account for your life. Are you preparing for that? Or are you ignoring that? And it's interesting that He's telling them all of these things. Look what He says in verse 26. He starts to interpret this dream for him. He says, the 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh that what he's about to do. And indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Wow, what a warning. Can you imagine your Pharaoh going, whoa, 7 years of plenty. We're going to have bumper crops for the next 7 years. But after the bumper crops, we're going to have 7 years of great famine in the land. And God, 2 different dreams confirms that. You know, God will often confirm things that He's showing you. You'll hear it multiple times in multiple situations. I can't tell you how many times that God's done that in my life, where God will kind of speak something to me, and then I just kind of like blow it off, and then I'll be driving down the road, and I'll be listening to a pastor on the radio, and then he'll speak the same thing to me, and I'm going, okay, that's crazy. I heard that same thing twice a day, and then I open my Bible to do my devotions, and then God says the same thing again, and I'm going, okay, this is it. I better pay attention. God's trying to get my attention. And God, 2 separate times, shows them the same dream. Had the same interpretation. God was trying to get his attention. And Pharaoh, now at this point, you know, all ears. Can you imagine at this point, he's all ears. He's got the interpretation of the dream now, but here comes the application of the dream. It's one thing just to know what's going to happen, but now what do you do with what you know? Right? There's a whole different thing when it comes to your actions upon what you know. Guys, I think all of us know about God. How many of us are actually living our lives in action about what we know about God? There's a big difference. And he's laying out for him, look, I told you what's going to happen. And then I love verse 33 that Joseph just didn't leave him in that position. Joseph now begins to give him instruction. Look at verse 33. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. And by the way, King, I know somebody that fits that bill. No. He didn't say that. He wasn't even talking about himself at this point. He just going, let me tell you, King, this is what you need to do. You need to find someone that's wise and someone that's discerning, that's going to be able to Follow out this plan. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. He goes, look, here's what we got to do. Here, for 7 years, you're going to have bumper crops. And what you need to do is take 20% of those crops and you just store them away. And have someone that's over that whole project where we're storing food for the 7 years that's going to come. It's going to be 7 years of famine. What an interesting application to the text. He goes, right now God is blessing. So take God's blessing and, begin to store it away so that when we're going through the hard times, you have something so that everybody could be sustained. That's very, very, very interesting how the application of the dream comes to pass, and Joseph begins to tell him. It's interesting because many of the commentators I was reading said that Pharaoh would tax 10%. But he doubled the tax. It's now 20%, 1/5. 1/5 of everything. Every crop that comes in, we're going to take 1/5 of it, and we're going to store it away. And for most of us here, you're going, if I only got taxed 20%, that'd be good, right? 20%. But for them, that was like, man, it's like that was doubling up. They were going to do double tax. It wasn't just going to be a single tax. But remember, there was going to be a bountiful 7 years. And so they weren't even going to miss it. And so here Joseph is telling them, this is exactly what you got to do, man. You got to get someone that's going to go over this whole matter. They're going to start to take that 20% of the crop. They're going to have places that they store it all so that when those 7 years of famine come, that we're going to be in a good position. Look at verse 37. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. Everyone listening going, man, that's wise. That's good decision making right there. I like your plan. And then Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Wow. This is what he acknowledged about Joseph. He says, let me tell you something, man. You are different than every other man I know. The Spirit of God is in you. This is a pagan. This is a heathen. And he was able to acknowledge that God was with Joseph. Man, what a great testimony. Let me tell you something. There's something different about Joseph than anybody else I've ever met. All my wise men, all my magicians, all of my counselors that are around me, something's different about Joseph. Joseph has a relationship with God, and the Spirit of God is with him. And then he says very simply there, verse 39, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all of this, there was no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow. Can you imagine Joseph waking up that morning thinking, just another day in the prison? Here we go. Talk to guys that are locked up, and you try to find ways to make the day go by, right? And you imagine here's Joseph just going, okay, here we go. I got to get in my routine, just trying to let the day go by. And then all of a sudden he goes, hey, Joseph, Pharaoh wants to talk to you. Go shave, man. Go change your clothes, take a shower, get ready, and you're going to be brought into Pharaoh. And as he's talking to Pharaoh, he went from a dungeon to second in command to only Pharaoh in all the land of Egypt. Wow. How in the world could someone prepare for that kind of responsibility? 7 years he would be gathering. The next 7 years he's going to be distributing all that he gathered to all the people. How does that happen? Let me tell you, I'm convinced that the 7 good years was he was training in Potiphar's house for 7 good years, man. He was learning how to control plenty. Potiphar was a very successful man. And he was day by day being faithful with the things that God had given to him, prospering it tremendously. And then for the next 7 years, man, remember, it was going to be 13 years that he's in the prison, man. So, 6.5, 7 years, right around that time period. 7 years in Potiphar's house. And then for the next 7 years, he's going to learn how to live in famine. He's in prison now. Learning how to live with and live without. Learning how to live on a very high scale, and then learning how to live on a very low scale. And it's interesting that God, for those years, was preparing Joseph for what he was going to have to face in the years to come. Can you imagine if he was just 17-year-old, a little shepherd, and then God puts him in that position where he's second in command of all of Egypt? He's like, oh, what do I do? No way, man. 13 years passed, and for those 13 years, man, he had been in the school of discipline that God was working him through. Guys, I think there's application here for all of us. No matter where you're at today, no matter what you're going through, understand something, man. God is preparing you for what he has for you. And sometimes it's not easy, man. Being a slave or being in prison or, going through difficult times is never easy. But Joseph was faithful where God had planted him, and that God was ready to use him for the thing that he had promised him. And so for, these 13 years, we're going to see that in a second, that he was being prepared for this very moment as he gets the news. Guess what? You're going to be ruler over my whole house. No one's going to be greater than you. Verse 41, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put gold chains around his neck. Now he's a rapper. No. You imagine, he's got the king's signet ring. That was bling right there. But now, you know what? It carried with it great power. Because the signet ring, anything that was stamped with the signet ring, meant that it had the king's authority along with it. So Joseph is given great influence and great power in the land of Egypt. Anything that Joseph stamped, it was like the king stamped it. Now he's walking around in linen clothes. He's got, gold necklaces, hanging off his neck. Everyone's going, man, that guy's somebody. Watch what happens next. And it didn't stop there. That's what happened behind closed doors. And now check this out. And he had him ride in the second chariot, which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. There was a parade just for Joseph. Here comes Pharaoh, everyone bows, and then here comes the next float. And here, Joseph just kind of doing the parade wave. Everyone bowing down, everyone bow down, and everyone bowing down. And Joseph now, in the eyes of the people, is acknowledged that it's Pharaoh and then Joseph. And everybody knows it. Except for his brothers, yet. That's the next couple chapters. Everybody knows it. That because Joseph had been faithful in the little things, and he had passed the test of temptation, and he had passed the test of not holding on to bitterness and anger his whole life, but saying, you know what, God, I just want to be where you want me to be. I just want to do what you want me to do. I just want to follow you with all my heart. At that moment, man, God goes, okay, now I found someone that I can use, and he puts Joseph in this position of authority. God can't use somebody unless they're tested. And you got to pass the test. And now Joseph being tested and passing the test, he's elevated to this incredible position. It says in verse 44, Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift up his hand or foot in the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph name Zaphaneth Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath. the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh and king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. In the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. And Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. I mean, what an incredible story. I mean, here comes Joseph. Not only does he elevate him to this position, but now he says, not only that, I got to get you a new name. You got to have an Egyptian name. He gives an Egyptian name. God never references an Egyptian name from this point forward. And then what's interesting is that now he gets an Egyptian wife, and it was one of the high priest's daughters, which would have been another, a great honor for Joseph. According to the Egyptians, and he's marrying the priest's daughter. And so it's interesting that Joseph now, starts his responsibilities. He's gathering up all of the food from all over the land. 1/5 of everything was now being taxed, and they was storing it all. And it tells us in verse 50, and this is incredible. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. God has made me forget all my toil, all my problems, all my issues. My family that forsook me, my Pharaoh, Potiphar. And you think about what's going on in the butler's mind at this point. Is Joseph going to get revenge? For 2 years, and Joseph never once even considers it. Can you imagine Potiphar's wife? He's second in command. I falsely accused him. What's he going to do at this point? To me, I'd imagine she'd want to leave town pretty quick, right? But here's what you find out about Joseph. Joseph never held on to the bad things that happened to him. Never. It tells us he named his first son Manasseh. Manasseh means forgetful. Forgetful. I mean, everything that happens behind me, I'm not going there, man. Paul in the book of Philippians, he says, "This one thing I do, I forget those things which are behind me, and I press forward to the things which are ahead, that I may lay hold of." That I may lay hold of the things that God has for my life. Guys, if you're going to live in the past, it'll destroy you. If you're going to live in what happened last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago or when I was a kid, you live there and you ponder it over and over and over again, all it does is destroy you. And the enemy wants nothing more, because if you can live there, man, then you'll never go forward. You'll never fulfill the purpose that God called you for. You got to forget those things which are behind you. And it's interesting that Joseph names his first son Manasseh. Every time he says Manasseh, he's got to remember, forget it. Forget everything back there, man. From here forward, I want to serve the Lord. And we can never totally forget it, and I understand that. But you don't have to dwell there. You don't have to dwell there. No one ever was able to solve things by playing things over and over and over and over in your mind. No one. All it does is torment you. And that you come to this place where you say, God, take those thoughts away, take that hurt away, take that bad thing that happened in my life away, my childhood, whatever it was. God, would you wash me from that and help me to go forward rather than live back over there? And it seems like Joseph had to come to that place in his life where he said, you know what? Manasseh, man, Manasseh, from now on, every time I say Manasseh's name, I'm going to forget back there. I love that's what he named his boy. And then it tells us he named his second boy. Named the second, verse 52, he called Ephraim, for God had caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Isn't that cool? Manasseh literally means fruitfulness. And he goes, even though the enemy intended it to be evil, God is going to use it for good. That's what he's going to tell his brothers. He's going to meet up with them finally. They're going to come and they're going to go, hey, we need some grain. And he's going to recognize them. And then, he's going to play a little cat and mouse game with them for a little while. And then he's going to finally tell them, you know who I am? I'm your bro. Can you imagine? We're dead. And then Joseph turns to me and says, let me tell you something. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. I forgive you guys. Can you imagine how much God had to work in Joseph's life for him to have that attitude? You wanted evil for me, but God was working it out for good. Man, to be able to turn around to someone who's hurt you and say, you meant evil, but God meant good. And Joseph, man, understood something. Let me tell you something. God had been faithful. God is faithful. God was faithful. No matter what. Even in my affliction, God was faithful. What a great testimony. It came to pass, there in verse 53, the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended. The 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was on all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. I just thought about it for a little while. I went, man, think about after 7 years of plenty, Joseph's going, man, I hope there's a famine. I hope there's a famine. Because, if there wasn't a famine, then he would have been a liar, a false prophet. And so this whole time he was boldly standing out, stepping out, just going, man, God, I hope you're going to do what you said you're going to do. And sure enough, just like God said, 7 years of blessing. And then can you imagine the drought comes in, the Nile dries up, all of a sudden the waters disappear and they have enough food stored away, and they have enough food for the next 7 years stored away. And that 8th year comes, and it says that the land of Egypt, verse 55, was famine, and the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. It's interesting that Pharaoh still calls him Joseph. He didn't call him his Egyptian name. I wonder if after those 14 years that he just said, man, you're not an Egyptian. You're a servant of the Most High God. And he wasn't going to try to belittle that or try to take that away from Joseph. He had such an incredible testimony that he just said, you know what? You go talk to Joseph about that. Wow. That's unbelievable. Watch this. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. Wow. To hear the voice of God, to know that God's in control, that He's the one who orchestrates the beginning to the end. And then you and I standing in the middle of this, and we're watching our world right now, and we're just going, man, it seems like Jesus is coming soon. And here's the cool things, guys. Romans 8:28, it says this, for we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to His purpose. For we know. See, that's faith. I know. no matter what happens in my life, that God is going to work it for good. I don't like the prison. I don't like the circumstances. I don't want to be in this predicament. But I know this, God can work it out for good if I love him. That he has a plan for my life. And it's really my role to submit to him so that plan can be fulfilled.